Thank you for your welcome. It's just great to be with you again. I wasn't going to tell this, but I just want to encourage you that what God is doing in our nation. Sometimes we think it's all gone a bit quiet, and what is God doing? But last year with OM, as a mission organisation, as Harry was saying, I had the privilege of speaking in 42 different churches across Scotland, from the very top of Lewis down to, Northumberland to Wooler. It was a crazy year, but it was fantastic. And I've seen churches. I was in Aberdeen at the King's Fellowship, King's Church, where 1,000 people met on a Sunday morning. I spoke to the kids' church later, and there were 120 kids in the kids' church. And that wasn't the Indian church upstairs. It was bonkers. But that Wednesday, I was in Glasgow at a free church with 25 at the free church. And you know what? It was just as precious. It was just as special. And the presence of the Lord was just as real. So from the very top of Lewis, I spoke in one church in Callanish. Lovely, lovely, dear free church folks. No feedback at all as you're speaking. Absolutely nothing. And I was talking to him about what God was doing in the world, how he was bringing so many Muslims to faith, how the church is just expanding. It's beyond count now, what God is doing. And I was just telling stories, and one dear old man who said nothing, nothing in his face. At the end, he just shook my hand with tears running down his face. And he said, "Thank you." That's all he could say, was thank you. And so I'm so aware that God is moving in our nation still. He's not finished with our nation. We're still, I've said this before and I'll say it again, he's still a nation which has got the call of God in her. He still has a purpose for Scotland. In my research, I looked at missionaries who'd been sent from Scotland, and there was one Aberdeen lad, a farmer, who was one-legged. He had in his youth, he had an accident, and he had one leg. But he was called to go to China. Last year, my wife was at a meeting, and there was a Chinese lady at this meeting, and she referred to this guy and how the city in China still has a significant Christian presence. And this guy, this one-legged farmer, went from Aberdeen to this place. And the mission board and selection was saying, "So, what? But you've got one leg. Why are you going?" He says, "Because all the two-legged ones won't." That call is still on our nation. This morning, I want to look at yoke, what Jesus meant by his yoke. Let me read from Matthew chapter 11. Ignore that bit at the moment. Just listen to Scripture. And if you want to look it up, that's even better. Matthew 11, from verse 25 to the end. "At that time, Jesus declared, 'I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.'" And we're going to go on a bit of a journey this morning. And we're going to come back to Genesis 15. A strange set of verses in Genesis 15, which I hope will begin to make sense. Genesis 15 from verse 5, when God makes a promise to Abraham about his descendants being greater than the stars in the sky. And in verse 5 it says, "And he brought him outside and said, 'Look toward heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them.' Then he said to them, 'So shall your offspring be.' And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Words which are repeated by Paul in Romans. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram, 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all of these, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abraham, and behold, a dreadful and great darkness fell on him. Then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And when the sun had gone down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. And on that day, the Lord make a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. A strange passage, but hopefully we will be able to shed some light on it in the next wee while. Jesus said, take my yoke upon you. I love the way the Message puts that passage. Are you tired? Are you worn out? Burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll live to live freely and lightly. But what does this mean? We read these verses and you, like me, will think, oh, that's wonderful. Are you burned out in religion? Are you worn out? Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. Somehow it feeds our souls, doesn't it? It's like fresh water. But I want to unpack this a little bit more, because it's something we read and listen to, but I'm not sure we fully understand what Jesus is getting at here. I've been studying this for 3 or 4 years. I'm busy writing something up about it. What is this yoke? Is it an agricultural implement? Yoke was used in the Old Testament frequently about oppression, and God prophesies that the yoke of oppression will be released. In Isaiah 9, he says, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. And Isaiah 43, see, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. God says, I'm going to break this yoke and I'm going to do a new thing. The yoke, in the context of Jesus' ministry, the rabbi's yoke, was the way he interpreted and applied the Torah, the Mosaic law. The rabbi's yoke was his teaching. So Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. Take my interpretation of Torah. Take my interpretation of the Mosaic law. Take my interpretation, and I'm doing a new thing. And if you want to look at it in the context of Matthew 11 and 12, is Jesus is saying the old covenant is finished. John the Baptist, who is the greatest of the old way of doing things, is going to be the least in the new way of doing things. He said, I'm doing a whole new thing. And it's the Messiah who does the new thing. And only Jesus can do the new thing, because only Jesus, the Son, knows the Father, and only the Father knows the Son, and only Jesus understands the implications of the Torah. Only Jesus understands what God was driving at in creation. Only Jesus understands what was really going on. Only Jesus understands the tune. Everybody else thought they knew the tune. Oh, but it was awful. Sadducees thought they knew the tune. Pharisees thought they knew the tune. The Essenes thought they knew the tunes. The Zealots, they all thought they knew the tune. And it was all a different tune. Oh, can you imagine? For the one who had perfect pitch, who knew the tune so well, the tune of creation, the tune of God's purpose, the tune of God's love. And Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. Take my understanding. Take my application of what this means. So we read in the Old Testament about this wooden yoke, this industrial, this agricultural implement, as being a tool of oppression, which the Messiah will break off. I really question if the Messiah is going to break off this kind of yoke, is he just going to give us another one? We hear stories about Jesus being a carpenter and being a brilliant carpenter, and how he made the best fitting yokes there was so they were comfortable. I do not subscribe to the unbiblical view. I'm going to nail my colours to the mast. Jesus gives us another example. Jesus fleshes this out in a way which we can all understand. I think he gives a more accurate picture. Now, I'm probably going to be stretching some of you here, and some of you thinking, oh, Chick, where are you going here? Please think about this. Please go home and study. Don't just take my word for it. Please don't do that. The only words which will be spoken this morning of accuracy are in here. Everything else is to be considered. Okay? So with that caveat. So, we did the story of the prodigal son, yeah? We did it in an amusing way. But Luke 15 is an incredible insight by the Son into what the Father is like. Only the Son knows the Father, and only the Father knows the Son. And to me, Luke 15 is one of the most deeply revealing passages in Scripture, where Jesus says, this is what my Father is like. And he tells them this parable starting in verse 1. It says, the Pharisees were basically saying, how come more people are going to your church than Jesus and ours? And Jesus unpacks it and tells them this parable. Not parables, but parable. One parable. The parable of the shepherd and the lost sheep. And as part of the same parable, it says parable singular is the lost coin. And then about the lost son, younger and older. And he unpacks this. The shepherd leaves 99 sheep in the wilderness and goes looking for one. Oh, thank you, you're keeping up with the thing more than I am. The shepherd noticed when the sheep was not there. He noticed that there was 99, but there was one that was missing. So he goes after the one that was missing. I mean, you think, what's the shepherd about? He's got 99. Why is he leaves the 99. Where's he leaving them? Out in the wild? Are they open to attack? What's going on here? And he goes after the one. But he finds the one. And he rejoices when he finds the one. And I don't know if any of you have been into farming or shepherds or know sheep at all. When sheep get lost, they poo on themselves. They get quite agitated and all the stuff. So the shepherd takes this smelly sheep and rejoicing lays it on his back. Then he goes home and he rejoices when he gets home. Jesus, the shepherd, takes you and me, smelly, not necessarily the best thing around. You know yourself better than I know you, and I know myself better than you know me, as somebody once said. If you knew what I'm really like, you wouldn't bother listening to me. But if I knew what you were really like, I wouldn't bother speaking to you. Forget that. But he takes a smelly, wriggling, lost sheep, and with joy, he puts it on his back. The shepherd realized when the sheep wasn't there. And he put it on his back, saying, I am not going to lose you again. I'm holding on to you. I'm embracing you. Then the coin is lost. That was the woman's life savings. That was her dowry. That's everything she got. That was her insurance, her life insurance policy. And she noticed when it wasn't there. And when she found it, she rejoiced. And she held that coin tightly. She wasn't going to lose it again. Each time they noticed that one was missing. God knows when you're lost. God knows when you're not there. Out of over 8 billion people in this world, God knows when one is missing. It started off with 100 sheep to 1, ratio of 100 to 1. Then the coin was 10 to 1. Then the son is 1 to 1. God notices. So we come to the lost son. Father, he rejects. He's basically saying, I want you dead. I want my inheritance now. He dishonored his father in a shameful way, which was appalling in that time and place. In fact, Deuteronomy, there's a verse in Deuteronomy, let me get it right, 21, which says, if a son is a drunkard and a glutton, bringing dishonor and shame, he should be stoned at the gates. This younger son was dishonoring and bringing shame on his father. But his father lets him go. The son wanted out, wasn't a happy place. So he goes, he spends his inheritance, he spends his share of the farm. The word for property in the Hebrew is bion, the living. It's not just money, it's the living, it's the livelihood of the family. He goes and wastes. But it says the father split them between the two. If the son gets his inheritance, then the older must get his inheritance. The older, being the first son, gets 2/3 of the living. And the younger son gets 1/3. So I don't know what the older son is carping on about later on in the story. He's got 2/3. But the younger son takes his 1/3 and off he goes. And of course it all goes wrong. He thinks he's left the problem behind him. I'll sort it. But have you ever noticed that the problem is you? You think, I'm going to go away and I'm going to do something different. I'm going to sort it out. And wherever you go, you are there. So the problem goes with you. Because actually you're the problem. How many times have you seen that in people's lives? You've observed it. Yeah? It's true. So the son thinks, I'm going to get out, I'm going to make things different, but actually he was the problem. So the problem went with him, and of course it all went belly up. Because the problem he was running from was himself. It's always like that. You can run all you like, but you're never free until you find peace. Peace within yourself. Peace with the Father. He had lost everything. He'd squandered everything. He'd spent everything. Except one thing. One thing he could never get rid of, no matter how hard he tried. The idea of home. He knew where home was. And he knew he wasn't there. So one thing he had got, an idea of home. And I think every human being, deep in their soul, knows where home is. And knows they haven't got it. And they'll try every which way to find home. Every which way to find home. Home is at peace with God. Peace within ourselves. A real, tangible peace, which you can almost feel. I don't know if you've ever felt that peace. peace with yourself, peace with God, peace knowing that I can relax, I can stop, I can breathe. If you don't know that peace is available for you today, now, to be found in the Father. He had lost everything apart from a memory of home. And home, what does home mean to you? Is it where you really belong? I was speaking to somebody recently, a young lad. I was surprised when he said, home, he says, he was a young lad who'd been to Magnitude, that wonderful festival. Did you hear about Magnitude down at Lendrickmuir? 1,800 kids at Magnitude this year. Wow! I used to worry about where's the next generation. I'm not worrying about that any longer. 1,800 kids. Wow! And young Tim, I was just picking up, taking him home. He says, oh, it's great. He says, but I can't wait to get home. He says, your own bed. He says, no, my own toilet. I can relate to that. I don't know if you can, but I can. Nothing like your own bed, is it, in your own loo? Home, where you really belong. Home where you can be yourself. But it's not a country. It's not a place. It's a peace, isn't it? You know that. Not pretending any longer. Not keeping up appearances. Just being. True home is found in the Father's house. So he knew he wasn't at home. He was homesick. And he turned and he began his long walk home. And we read in, what verse is it? He decides he needs to go home. Then he's got a phrase in verse 18. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, forgive, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. This is the phrase that was going through his mind, that he was rehearsing. I don't know if you ever do it. When you're going to go to an interview or you're going to speak to somebody, you've got something going round and round in your head. If this is what I'm going to say. This is what I need to say. And it goes round and round in your head. And his phrase was, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired hands. And he was practicing his speech. And as he was practicing, next slide please, can you do it for me? Oh, cheers. He was expecting this. Make me like one of your hired hands. I want to work. I've blown it. I've dishonored you. Make me a servant. That's the only way he could imagine being in the Father's house. The only way he was to earn his keep, pay his way. He owed so much. He had squandered the whole of the livelihood of his father's inheritance. He'd given it away. How on earth could he repay such a debt? I need to work. I need to be a hired hand. And he was rehearsing this as he walked home. He was imagining all the different outcomes, how it would play out, like you do. And as he neared home, something amazing happened. He had been dreading the walk of shame through the village. He'd have to walk through the village. All the villagers would have to look at him. He'd have to feel the shame, the humiliation, as he made his way to the Father's house. Would he even get into the village? Or would the villagers remember Deuteronomy 21 and not even let him go in, but stone him to death outside the village? What would happen? He didn't know. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Oh, this speech, if only he could get to his father. If only, would the father even listen? Would he even get to the door? Would the father even answer the door? Would the father turn him away? He had every right to. Would the father get his servants to beat the son of him? That's what should have happened in the first place. But as he approached the village, he saw his father running towards him. But this is an old guy. Old guys don't run. It's humiliating. It's embarrassing. in an old guy in that culture. But he was running, and he was running to the village gates, and he ran through the village gates. He ran to the place where the son should have been stoned. But the father was there instead. The father was answering this is my son. And the villagers, what was going to happen? All of a sudden, all the eyes and heads would have turned. Spades would have been dropped in the fields. Buckets would have been dropped at the well. Bread would have been left in the oven as they all ran to see what was going to happen. What was the father going to do? What was going to happen to the shameful son? How was he going to respond? How do we respond? And the next slide. Something totally unexpected. Something totally which freaked everybody. The father answered the questions by embracing the son. Something the son never expected would happen. The father threw his arms around about him. My son, I lost you, but you are home. And the father throws his arms around him and says, accept him. The son was expecting an agricultural yoke, an industrial yoke, a wooden yoke. What was the yoke he got instead? An embrace. That's a yoke. That goes around about your shoulders. But it was an embrace. That's the yoke the son came back to. Of course he went to work in his father's farm. But he worked out of love. Not out of earning his keep. Not out of paying his debt. But out of being accepted. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you will find rest for your souls. What was Jesus' yoke? It was the Father's embrace, wasn't it? And his baptism, his Father said, this is the Son in whom I'm well pleased. That was Jesus' yoke. That was the embrace that he knew. And Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. Take my Father's embrace. Take my understanding of the Torah. Take my understanding of the law. It's brand new. And know my embrace. It's not an agricultural instrument. It's not a thing of work. It's a thing of love. Jesus took the wood so you could take the embrace. Yeah? So the son never got to say the servant bit because the father cut him off. The father actually embraced him before he could get those words out of his mouth. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. You bet you have. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Absolutely right. Stop right there. As the father embraced him. Was he just overwhelmed by love? So that he thought this is a complete waste of time, I'm not even going to say the rest of the sentence? Or did the father stop him saying it? You chose to go, and you chose to come home, but I choose how I relate to you. You do not choose how I love you. I choose how I love you. Do not negotiate with me. The father embraced him, all of him. The father embraced the son in his totality. The father embraced him, the smelly, stinking son who'd been walking for how many days, who smelled of pig poo, who was hungry, who was dusty. The son who had rejected the father, who turned his back on the father. The father accepted and embraced even that. And even the thoughts and all that the son had ever been, the father embraced. You don't have to bring your good bits to God. You bring all of your bits to God. The bits you're embarrassed about, the bits you're ashamed of, the bits that you think about and you wish a hole would appear in the floor. You haven't told anybody about it, but you know about it. And Satan, doesn't he half cast it up at you, doesn't he? He says, call yourself a Christian. Oh, we all know that. The father embraces that. Even that. Even that. If he had come back as a hired hand, he would have imposed his relationship with the father. nothing would have changed. The Son would still have been the Son. He'd have said, I want my identity. I'm going to work for my living now. Nothing would have changed at all. But the Father didn't allow that. The Father said, your identity is now in me. We want to tell God what our relationship is to be. We want to dictate to God, I'll come to church and I'll worship you and I'll do this and do that, but I'm not doing this. We continually like to negotiate with God about our relationship with Him. That is a complete no-go. God shuts us up. Don't you even talk to me about how I should love you. Don't even talk to me about how I should relate to you. Don't even go there. But we do. God doesn't negotiate. He just accepts. And this is why we've got to go back to Genesis 15 now. That strange verse where God makes a covenant with Abraham. It's a very strange verse, isn't it? Let me read a bit to you from Jeremiah 34:18 about making a covenant. Those who have violated my covenant and have not fulfilled the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat like the calf they cut in two, then walked between its pieces. If you cut a covenant with somebody, the idea of cutting the calf and the heifer and the goat and everything in two is that the two of you walk between the thing, and he said, well, if you break the covenant, that's what's going to happen to you. Or if I break the covenant, that's what's going to happen to me. That's the idea. So God makes a covenant with Abraham, and they split the calf and they split the blah blah. Who walks between the pieces? Abraham is in a deep sleep. And then there's what they call a theophany, a fancy word for presence of God. And the smoking pot and the burning fire go between the pieces. Abraham is asleep. And only God goes between the pieces, not Abraham. God says, I'm making a covenant with you, Abraham. And if either of us foul up, God ain't going to foul up. If either of us is going to foul up, I'll take the hit. I'll carry the cost. That's what God is saying way back in Genesis 15. I'll carry the cost. And the cost was to be broken. And hello, what did Jesus do on the cross? What was broken? Who physically fulfilled that covenant made with Abraham? God says, if you foul up, I'll take the hit. If you foul up, I'll carry the cost. Younger son, if you foul up, the Father carried the cost. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you will find rest for your souls. You will be home. No longer negotiating, no longer feeling you have to make yourself something to be of worth. You are of worth because the Father has embraced you. Have you noticed that we start the Lord's Prayer with our Father who is in heaven? Sin comes halfway down. Sin got to be dealt with, of course. But the Lord's Prayer starts with our Father. It starts with that embrace. But what are we going to do with this? How do we respond to such incredible love? Do we carry on negotiating? Do we carry on drawing lines and saying, God, this far and no further? Do we carry on trying to earn our keep, make ourselves acceptable to Him and to others, to make ourselves better in our own sight, to make ourselves feel valued by what we do? There's a whole other subject there. Or do we just actually, which the Son did, allow himself to be embraced. What happened? What would have happened if the son said, "Oh, no, Father, no, just hang on a minute. I've got something to say to you. I've got to get these words out of my mouth." Would the father have turned away sadly and realizing my son hasn't changed? He's still trying to negotiate. He's trying to negotiate his way into my house. He doesn't get it. Stop trying to negotiate with God. Stop saying, "Lord, I'll give you this and I'll keep this," or stop trying to make yourself more acceptable to him. Stop trying to clean up your act so that you're more acceptable to him, so he'll love you more. No. Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you and you will find rest." So I suggest as we take communion, this is not just bread and wine. This is the Father throwing his arms around you. What are you going to do? What are you going to do?